Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this meeting sponsored by the Tricontinental Platform. I'd like to, first of all, send revolutionary greetings from the United States to our brothers and sisters, comrades and friends in the UK. Our struggles are indivisible. I've been asked today to speak on the current situation in the United States, particularly with reference to the situation in Ferguson, Missouri. As people know who have been following the situation since August, the African-American masses and their allies in Ferguson, Missouri have been waging a protracted struggle against police repression, against the racist court system, and against the overall economic exploitative conditions that African Americans are living under in Ferguson. Ferguson is a suburb of St. Louis, which is a major United States city. The county government that encompasses St. Louis proper, as well as the suburb of Ferguson, has a long history of repression and racism directed against the African American population. This goes back many, many years. Even though Missouri was not one of the Confederate states that broke with the United States during the 1860s that led to the Civil War, anyone who has studied the history of race relations in the United States can recall the Dred Scott decision, which was handed down in 1857. Dred Scott escaped African slave, attempted to sue in an effort to bring about freedom for his wife and family. And Justice Taney, in his infamous decision, one quote from that decision noted that a black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect, meaning that the constitutional guarantees that were put in place in the 1780s through the early part of the 19th century, as far as the United States Constitution is concerned, its Bill of Rights, that those constitutional guarantees do not apply to African people or people of African descent in the United States. Now, even though the Civil War ostensibly led to the legal emancipation of the African population in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, and then later there was the passage of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Even today, the same principles that guided the Dred Scott decision, in effect, are still in practice in the United States, and we can see that clearly in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, in the United States, the conditions of the African American people are still heavily underdeveloped and oppressed, despite the fact that in the United States there is a president of African descent, Barack Obama. There are members of the United States Congress called the Congressional Black Caucus. There are many African American mayors, city council persons, county representatives, and other local, statewide, and federal officials. Nonetheless, if you look at the data related to the conditions of African people, still we suffer an unemployment rate twice as high as that of the white population. We still have largely disproportionate rates of impoverishment. We are still victims of police brutality. So despite the fact that Barack Obama has been president of the United States now for 5.5 years, he has not, of course, done anything to really correct the oppressive conditions of the African American people. A good example of this, of course, is the rebellions that have been erupting in Ferguson over the last 2.5 months. Because of the national and international media coverage of events in Ferguson, the administration was forced to make two statements related to the situation in Ferguson. But these statements did not necessarily call for a complete end to police terrorism against African Americans. Neither did it call for any serious effort to address the disproportionate impoverishment, unemployment, and the impact of the repressive apparatus of the state in regard to the conditions of African Americans. So this is why the young people in Ferguson have had no other alternative except to go into the streets. We saw them battling the police in August for nearly 2 weeks in a row. We have also seen subsequent demonstrations. We have also seen national mobilization efforts where people have come to Ferguson and to St. Louis to protest and demand that this white police officer, Darren Wilson, be indicted and put on trial for the murder of 18-year-old Michael Brown, who was unarmed, who did not have a warrant out for his arrest, who was accosted by this police officer and shot several times, execution style, as we say here in the United States. Nothing has been done to this white police officer. He has not been indicted. He has not been arrested. What has happened, though, is an attempt by the corporate media, by the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office, to criminalize Michael Brown in his death by saying that he somehow provoked Darren Wilson to carry out this heinous murder. Well, most people reject this assertion. So-called autopsy report was released yesterday in the attempt to further criminalize Michael Brown in his death. He's not here to speak out on his own behalf to defend himself, so consequently, his family, his colleagues in Missouri, and people throughout the United States and indeed the world have to stand up on his behalf. What's also important about these developments in Ferguson is that it is relatively common for African Americans, for Latinos, people from the Middle East, and others to fall victim to state repression in the United States. It happens every single day. There are numerous cases that are documented and other cases that are undocumented. Fortunately now, with video cameras, with cell phone cameras, a lot of this repression is able to be recorded and reproduced. And this, of course, has shed a much brighter light on the nature of the repressive conditions under which oppressed people suffer from inside the United States. Therefore, this has awakened consciousness throughout the world. And what was quite interesting when you looked at the presentation of President Barack Obama before the United Nations last month in New York, the General Assembly, he was compelled to mention that inside the United States there are still problems associated with the relationships between African Americans and the broader white capitalist ruling class. However, he never says anything about doing or creating policies that would recorrect these oppressive conditions. So the struggle in Ferguson is not just a local struggle, it's a national struggle, and even I would venture to say an international struggle. Because what it exposes is the hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism, which, as a matter of its own foreign policy, justifies military actions throughout the Middle East, throughout North Africa, against countries in Asia, for example, China, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and other states which are on the so-called hit list of U.S. imperialism. So how can the United States, on the one hand, claim to be a nation that upholds human rights, that criticizes other states for engaging in human rights violations, when in fact right here inside the United States, they are engaging on a systematic basis every single day in the oppression of African American people and other oppressed people inside the United States. So therefore, we have to conclude that the struggle in Ferguson has global implications. The President of the United States would not address racism inside this country if the people in Ferguson had not gone into the streets, both violently as well as non-violently, to protest against the brutal slaying of Michael Brown. There have been 2 other African Americans who have been killed in St. Louis County since the brutal killing of Michael Brown. One was killed just 2 weeks ago in South St. Louis. Another was killed in the immediate aftermath of the murder of Michael Brown. The police claimed he had a knife. He refused to put the knife down, and consequently, he was shot to death. What has distinguished the situation in Ferguson and in St. Louis is that the masses went into the streets, and they were able to face the militarized police forces who utilized armaments that have been supplied by the United States Pentagon that are being supplied all over the country to local police agencies. These people have Humvees. They have submachine guns. They have all types of noxious and deadly gases that are being utilized on largely peaceful protesters and demonstrators who are standing up against racist violence. So we see a militarization of law enforcement inside the United States, which just didn't begin this year in 2014. It goes back all the way at least until the late 1960s, when we had mass rebellion throughout the United States. There was an agency created under the Nixon administration, which came into office in 1969, called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA. And their objective was to provide material support to police agencies across the United States in order to suppress the rebelling African American and Puerto Rican masses who were, in fact, torching cities, who were fighting police and other races in the streets. The Black Panther Party came out of that period, beginning in 1965 and 1966 in Lowndes County, Alabama, and of course extending after 1966 to Oakland, California, where Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The Black Panther Party attempted to organize international support for the African American struggle inside the United States. They viewed the struggle in the same manner that Malcolm X and other progressive forces during the 1960s viewed the struggle of African Americans as a national liberation struggle against capitalism and imperialism. This is why the Black Panther Party, beginning in 1969, began to look to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in order to build not only international support for the struggle here in the United States, but also to, in fact, learn lessons from the struggle of the Korean people, which extended back to the occupation of Japanese imperialism beginning in the first part of the 20th century. They were able to defeat Japanese imperialist occupation. The whole struggle that developed after 1945, the formation of the DPRK in 1948, the consolidation of the communist and democratic forces inside of North Korea, and then, of course, the aggressive policies of the United States utilizing the United Nations beginning in 1950, where they engaged in a brutal war against the DPRK. Even before 1950, the targeting of communists and revolutionary Democrats in Korea, both in the North and the South, resulted in the deaths of many patriots and revolutionaries. Some figures that have been released in regard to the impact of the U.S. imperialist war against the people of Korea indicate that anywhere between 2 to 4 million people were killed during this war, particularly between 1950 and 1953. With the support of the volunteers forces from China under Mao Zedong and the heroic efforts of the Korean revolutionaries, they were able to prevent the destruction of the DPRK and beat back U.S. imperialism to where it is and where it remains today through their occupation of South Korea. Therefore, we see the situation involving U.S. imperialism today as a global struggle. We therefore recognize that the DPRK is a clear target of U.S. imperialism. Just over the last several months, there have been many threats against the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Workers' Party of Korea, and we stand in solidarity with the DPRK and all socialist, revolutionary, national democratic governments and organizations throughout the world. Their struggles are our struggles. We face a common enemy, and that enemy is international racism, national oppression, global capitalism, and imperialism. And the situation is getting worse. It's not getting any better. If we look at the overall economic decline of U.S. imperialism and world imperialism in general since 2007 and 2008, we realize that the imperialists and the capitalists, they have no solution to the current economic crisis. Their only response, of course, is repression domestically and aggressive militarism on an international level. We see it in Iraq. We see it in Syria. We see it in Yemen. We see the blatant interference in the internal affairs of the peoples of Sudan, Zimbabwe, and other areas throughout Africa. We see the constant destabilization efforts of revolutionary and socialist governments in South America and in Latin America. The war against Cuba continues. The efforts to destabilize Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador also continue. Even countries that are not considered socialist, but which have taken a stand against international finance capital, for example, Argentina, are being subjected as well to destabilization efforts and threats against their government. So we feel very strongly that the struggle is reaching a critical stage worldwide, and that as revolutionaries and as advocates of national liberation and socialism, we have to present alternatives to imperialist domestic and foreign policy. And that's why I think the Tri-Continental Platform is so important. We need to engage in this dialogue. We need to exchange our own experiences, because it is very, very important during this critical stage that world imperialism is challenged and that it is effectively combated through alternative policies and an effort to organize people on a grassroots level, both inside the imperialist camp and in alliance with those who are struggling against imperialism throughout the world. So I'll end right there. I want to thank you once again for this invitation, and please continue your sterling efforts to build broader unity among anti-imperialist forces in the UK and indeed throughout the world.